Okay, team, I'd like to move forward into the practical. So this is the diagram you will see in the FHIR spec in the terminology section. And we've dealt pretty much with identifying things. We've dealt with what code systems are in the theoretical. We've dealt with value sets are in the theoretical. I've said I'm not doing the concept map because mapping is a whole new board game. So I want to now go into the things that in FHIR make terminology real. Because nobody does terminology for fun unless they are really sad. So we're going to be looking quickly first at the data types that use terminology in FHIR, which are these ones here: code, coding, and codeable concept. And thankfully, they're in the simple or the general purpose, and they're not in the really, really complex ones. So code. How many of you are already dealing with just code? I should think everybody is, because I guess it appears in almost every resource for things like status. So all you're doing is carrying, for the machine, the unit of thought. You're just carrying the code, and the code system that you're dealing with is implicit in the resource definition itself. And here's a very simple example. It's a status code in the observation resource. The code system that it's drawn from is in the resource itself, and you can then go and look in the XML at what the values are, and no doubt you're going to take that XML and put it into a spreadsheet. So simple. It's all done for you. Everything is defined, isn't it? So what are you going to ask when you're presented with a fait accompli? Do the concepts in that code system meet your business use case? So one of my other hobby horses about being a terminologist is you must be a good business analyst. You have to find your SMEs and you have to draw things out of them, sometimes with needles. Oh, well, I only need active and inactive. Sure. You ever going to deprecate? You ever going to retire? No. 3 months into the project. Oh, this one's going to be deprecated. You said you didn't need that. Drawing out what your business actually needs is a key skill for any terminologist. Can you make a different value set from the code system that's already defined? And I think here there is some confusion in the writing between the code system and the value set. This is in blue, this is a Julie thing. See, the value set is designated, the entire code system value set for observation status. I think it does make sense, but I think there's ways that we could write this better to be clearer for people who are actually using it. So who is responsible for this code system and value set? Is it likely to change? Everything's likely to change. Is it okay for your business use cases? How can you monitor the fact that there is or isn't change built into this? At the moment, these sorts of things are usually assigned to a work group. Is your project, is your implementation guidance, this discussion I was having with Graham earlier, we're working differently. What is your relationship with the work group that owns this code system that you are dependent on in your IG? Do you know anyone in there? Would you know who to go and chew their ear about if it wasn't right? These are things we need to think about. If you have concerns about using the code data type in a particular place in a resource, it's not something that can be changed. It's a data type. It's not something you can change easily through implementation guidance directly. But of course, you can add an extension. And I love this phrase. There is supposed to be no stigma associated with the use of extensions. I don't know what I think about that. I guess it all depends on your use case. If it's an analysis use case, oh, trust me, there's going to be a stigma associated with it. Or, this is a community. You need to work through the community and the community processes to change it. But that may not be fast. And that requires a degree of engagement and a degree of commitment. And some of you have projects that can't afford to do that, I guess. And that's challenging. One of my most difficult HL7 meetings ever was 10 or 12 years ago, and Lloyd will probably remember it, when a whole set of Canadian specifications came forward into pharmacy, sort of lock, stock and barrel, and we'd agreed to it. They'd told us in advance. I think we just hadn't realised quite how many, and we were sort of reeling from it. And in the end, everybody had just negatively balloted it. In those days of that sort of balloting process. And so there was this real standoff between people who needed to get stuff done for their working implementations and who'd been very upfront about it and were actually, to be honest, quite hurt, not the least to say pressured by their paymasters, and those of us in the rest of the community just going, ah! And walking through that negotiation was nothing to do with computer science. It was all to do with trust and people. And in the end, we negotiated a compromise, and Canada put more effort in, and we put more effort in, and I think they got better specs as a result of it. And I actually think they got a better implementation as a result of it. But you may not always have the time and luxury to do that. And so that's quite a challenge when you're using code, and when the system says that you're using code. And I don't have any easy answers, I'm afraid. So then we're on to coding, the representation of a defined concept using a symbol. Oh, I don't like symbol there, sorry, from a defined code system. Because, as I said, to me, symbol is part of the human readable designation. It's the icons, it's the emoticons. So, sorry, I wince a bit with that phrasing. And these are the attributes of coding, and there's that thing about symbol, and then to me that is just code. But I do understand, one of the principles of defining something is that you don't repeat the thing in the definition. And I must admit, I went away and used synonym facilities in things and see if I could come up with anything better, and I haven't yet. But if I don't like it, I need to. And here we have the representation, the human readable term. And here, actually, it's primarily designed to carry text, unless you can get your symbol in Unicode. And I possibly would challenge that. Limitations and no example. I couldn't find anywhere that just uses coding. Maybe that's my failure to understand where I should have been looking or how I should have been looked, but I didn't find any easy examples of resources that were using coding. Lots using code, lots using Codeable Concept. It can be bound to a value set. All its attributes are optional. And it seems to me, as I say, that it's not used as a data type in its own right, but it's almost always used as one of the main parts of Codeable Concept, which is very similar, except that it allows for provision of text.
Except for what? Can you repeat that?
It allows for provision of text. And it can, and I think it should, be bound to a value set. So this is the coding reused in this bit here, is that bit there, is reused in the Codeable Concept. And the way that you express a unit of thought in more than one code system is that you recurse it round. So if you need to send a diagnosis in both SNOMED and MEDRA, for example. So binding, this little magic word here, the term used to describe providing the value set for any artifact or element. We've already talked about binding strengths, the four binding strengths that you can actually use. No, sorry, we talked about the 4 levels of this is the 4 binding strengths. It's required, you shall use it. I prefer must, actually. You must use it from the specified value set. Extensible. If it's present in your value set, if the unit of thought that needs to be communicated is present in the value set, you must use a coded concept from that value set. But if you can't find it, then you can use an alternate coding or text. So, very practical, but harder to implement because you've got to offer the user alternative things. And certainly for analysis, much more variable, particularly if text is there. How many of you are using the extensible binding or plan to use the extensible binding? Can you give me a sense of why that's what you're going to choose, Mark?
There are many examples, but for example, genomic tests, there's a finite set that are known now, but there's certainly more every day.
More every day. Change happens.
Is that different? How is that different from a dynamic value set in that example?
That's a great question. A lot of the tests that do exist aren't registered in any code system. So they're not registered in any code system. So in the meantime, and they may not be inside the user's hospitalist system, their EHR. So that's why text is sometimes necessary.
So can I check back with you before you take the mic from him? What you're doing actually in the extensible is allowing text rather than 2 alternate code systems.
We're not specifying what you could do with the extension because there are multiple sources of vocabulary. We would prefer if your genomic test were in LOINC, but it's not going to be. There's another place called GTR, the Genomic Test Registry, but that's not the only place. So GTR is kind of our second choice, although that's where most of them live. And then the third choice, there's other registries for tests. We'd prefer you don't use them, like one's a UK registry.
So can I come back to you? Why are you not building a value set from those 2 code systems?
Well, GTR isn't supported by FHIR.
Right, okay. Would that be your choice?
We can change that.
And also, one more thing about GTR is not a curated set at all. It's done by the test vendors on a voluntary basis.
Okay. So what I'd like to pick out for the group there is someone who, are you up at the 10,000 hours mark, possibly? Yes? Nearly?
I don't know, that's probably just yesterday.
You know, someone with a good experience in this is saying, well, yeah, here is another code system, but it's not curated, it's volunteer. It's not good enough to be in my main value set, but I recognize it exists. I'm not going to make it official by building a value set with 2 sets of codes. I really want you to use LOINC if you possibly can, but practically, I will accept either text or a code from that code system in this alternate situation. But I'm not giving it the value of saying it's in my value set. I think Graham's bringing it.
Oh, thank you. You touched on something that I remember several years ago working on a CDA IG. This came up, and there seemed to be some debate at the time, and maybe it's been resolved, but as to whether a value set can be drawn from multiple code systems.
Absolutely it can, and I have some slides about that.
Thank you.
Are you going to talk more about extensible?
I'm certainly going to talk about codes, drawing value sets from more than one code system, but that's not extensible.
No, okay.
So I wasn't going to plan to go on fire question at me, Graham.
Well, I was going to say a few more things about extensible. So extensible arises in multiple different contexts. So there is dynamic reference sets, although we don't mark them as dynamic, we just don't specify a version, or there's some ways to handle that. It's a versioning question.
That, you said reference set, not value set.
Value set then, I meant
Dynamic
value set.
though, isn't the same as an extensible binding.
No, it's not. But sometimes the use cases overlap, right? So, typically value sets are extensible because you can get a community to agree on a subset of the overall problem. And so you say, okay, we nail down this subset.
From LOINC, in Mark's example.
Right, and over time we'll chip away at the rest to get more agreement. So it's really one of the core challenge for extensible is that you can't get enough agreement in the community. Then there's the whole text only. So you can label something as extensible because you want text or not. But actually, if you want a required binding with text, there's other ways to do that. So you shouldn't use extensible just because you want to allow text. And you should use extensible because you actually have got partial agreement.
Can I stop you there? Because the very fact that you're using Codeable Concept allows you to use text. It's not the binding, is it?
Well, with text only. Sorry, text only.
Text only.
And then I just also wanted to mention that there is you can also say that this, and this is something that we do a lot in Australia, we say this is the extensible value set. You're supposed to use one of these codes for these concepts, or you can use any other code, but it must be a SNOMED code. So that you can say that with the max value set, to say, we've agreed about this list of codes, but anything else you use has to come out of SNOMED. Now, whether you...
How did you say that in an extensible binding?
You supply a max value set over the top of the extensible binding.
In the CLD?
No, it's the binding, not in the value
binding?
set. In the binding, yes.
I just have to go back to the spec and check that.
Yep, it's in there.
Okay.
So you can say the max value set, which is that you've defined an extensible value set, and then any other code has to come from a particular value set. And we use this in the specification for language and for UCOM codes, where people have terminology frameworks that can deal with an enumerated list of codes. And they want an enumerated list of codes to hit the common codes. So we say, okay, here's an extensible value set. You've got to use these codes if these are the right codes. But by the way, the full set of codes has to be a valid UCOM code or a valid IETF language code. So sometimes, particularly with post-coordinated concepts, you might want to do that. But after observing a lot of discussion here, extensible is very challenging because the fundamental underlying concept is partial agreement. And that implies some fuzziness about the degree of partialness to the agreement amongst different members of the community. And I've watched various communities maintaining implementation guides go backwards and forwards on just how much agreement they think they have.
Can I come back to your example when we've done the value set drawing from two different code systems? Because the difference between what you're describing there is use this or you can use SNOMED compared to using two different...
Right, they're different things, yes.
Yeah, they are different things, but the nuance of the difference needs teasing out.
Sure, thanks for teasing that out. And of course then what happens is, it turns out that you said you can use anything from SNOMED. Of course that's not what's actually happening in practice, so then that's a different kind of question and comes back to Julie's point about teasing things out of the community with needles.
Moving on to preferred, instances are encouraged to draw from the specified codes for interoperability purposes, but are not required to do so. So to translate that, Graham, that's the community doesn't really agree at all.
Well, actually what it means is almost all of the community agrees, but some small part of the community passionately disagrees.
Well, I think I phrased that exactly.
You should not be using preferred in implementation guide.
You should not, and you certainly should not be using exemplar.
I didn't say that.
I do.
It depends on what your implementation guide is trying to do. So if you've got an implementation guide where you're going to say, and the billing code goes here, and you're at the international level, you have no hope of getting consensus, and you shouldn't try. Preferred can often be a useful thing to do when you're not at the point where you're ready to try to get consensus, but you're trying to nudge. And you've got enough consensus that people are willing to let you nudge, but they're not willing to let you lock it down.
I think that's fair, but what that implies is not only do we have resources that have good exemplar bindings, and please, I believe that a resource should not have a codable concept without an exemplar binding. And even if that's a case of you put a minimum of 3 examples of those units of thought, if you can't find a minimum of 3, and I've actually been involved in specifications where it's actually, in the information model, it's been hard to find 3 different examples, and I'm thinking, why the heck is this a coded attribute in the first place if I can't find more than 3 examples of units of thought that would go in there? But it also means you've got levels of implementation guidance, and Lloyd is going to fight me again on this one. Go on, give him the mic.
So the reason why you might not provide a binding, you absolutely need to list examples, but sometimes you're better off listing your examples in text and not defining codes that you're afraid people might actually use.
I'm sorry, yes, I meant that they were just literally the units of thought in either text or symbol.
So maybe we should put an extension on code system to say you can't use this in practice, only in the implementation guide. But there are a few codable concepts in the spec, the base resources, that don't have example codes, but as the resources move up the maturity model, they are required to get example bindings for the reason Julie just said. But you might want to be more specific about the kind of examples you imagine in an implementation guide, and as a matter of guidance in an example binding. So you could still do an example binding in an implementation guide.
you can, but that's not going to be something that can be...
Well, it's better to be more specific than example, but sometimes you can't.
Most of the people here are actually building implementation guidance that's got to be implemented for real tomorrow.
Well, typically what happens, I mean, this is my experience in watching the communities that we have, is the communities will gather and agree that they can nail down that they're going to exchange a set of information, and they'll focus on the high yield value sets, and they do nail those down to required or extensible, but there's still stuff that they just haven't got the energy to nail down.
Okay. If you haven't got the energy to nail it down, that's an interesting phrase to... oh, I was much better without those lights glaring at me, Graham. Leave it unplugged. Yeah, the community doesn't have the energy to sort this out. Terminology costs. Terminology costs in energy as well as time and resources. Binding rules are specified in the FHIR spec. And I've not gone into these in detail, and maybe I should have done, but to me they're like writing pseudocode. It's the if this, then that, and that, if this, then that, and maybe if this, then, and then. And if you're down in this level, then you need to be familiar with those rules and those patterns, but you can look them up and work them through rather than me. Note from Julie, it might be helpful to remind implementers of these, not necessarily yourselves as writers of implementation guidance, but implementers at the start of the guidance so that they obey them in the use of value sets that they're bound to. The binding process, the syntax that does the binding, is present in the element definition. Good grief, Graham, I haven't seen ISO 11179 come up for a long time. And here it is in the metadata of the binding syntax. So what I think we've pretty much gone through this already in that discussion. It depends, what binding should you be using? Depends on the data type. The advantages of the stronger bindings, the required, the extensible, are clarity. There isn't a question. If I've got to build a UI, I haven't got to offer this set of codes, and then if you can't find one of these, how about one of those? And particularly if you're doing analysis, in my world in clinical research, that's something that strong binding is almost essential for some of the things that we do. One of the, in a sense, hidden disadvantages of strong binding, not just the fact that it's restricting, is that actually sometimes it can warp the data. I've only got these set of, for whatever reason, I've only got these 6 set of codes, and I'm not part of the community that's developed the value set, but I'm a bog standard user, and I can't be bothered to feed back to you that it's not meeting my use case. So I'll choose one of these 6 and get on with it. I can't be bothered to do text or whatever. And I'm not actually giving you the true data. I'm giving you what fits to your value set. I think most of us are familiar with, as in healthcare processes have been computerized, you get that dip in data quality at the beginning of a new implementation until it picks up. And you just have to face that. It just happens unless you're amazingly fortunate. So we've done these 3 originally, and now we've looked at how you use the 3 FHIR data types and the element definitions and bring those together. Code system selection, the Semino desiderata. I've used this as one of my gospels for as long as I've been doing terminology. But you'll note it was written in the 21st century. It was written in 1998, actually back in the days when Jim Semino used to come to HL7 from Columbia. And as I say, I revisit it on a regular basis, and I revisited it to prepare this talk, and I thought, do you know, I'd actually really like to rewrite this. I'd like to rewrite it, you know, as it's, oh, Graham says, go for it. Okay, I might. You know, 21, in a sense, 21 years on, you know, as it comes of age, is this really now what we want? And to do this, I actually reordered it in a different way. When Jim wrote it, he had everything, in a sense, with equal value. And I don't think it does have. Sorry, I overskipped that. I've grouped things in a different way, and I'd like to discuss them as we go through them in a different way. You know, the estate agents say, when you come to sell your property, it's location, location, location. This is the content, content, content. And although the codeable concept data type allows for text, the code data type doesn't. And so this is possibly the most important consideration. But sometimes things get so big, and they've got so much content and so much granularity that actually they are very, very difficult to use well. And users get lost in them, even if they've got the 10,000 hours expertise. So I'm not absolutely sure that content, content, content is everything. But I am sure that if the code system you're supposed to be using doesn't meet your use cases, you are in trouble. So it's, you know, it's what are the units of thought? This is coming back to how good your business analysis is as terminologists. What are the units of thought that you need to express, that you need to communicate in this coded element? And multiple granularities are good because they allow us to express more detail. But it's very important to have balance, especially in a value set. So I've got my element family pet. And I've got concepts in my value set like hamster and guinea pig and rabbit. And I've drawn them from my small animals code system. But suddenly for dogs, I've taken my code system, my value set from the kennel cub breeds code system. And I've got standard poodle and King Charles Spaniel. Can you see? I've got a real mixed granularity here. I'm going to puzzle my users, particularly if they're real guinea pig fans and they want to say, you know, it's, and it comes back to Graham's, you know, community understanding and who has the hobby horse of what. And, you know, no doubt the dog lobby was really strong here. And it's your job as terminologists, as value set builders, to control that enthusiasm and to not have value sets with mixed granularity unless you're sure that they're going to bring you the value. So it's a silly example, but we've got hundreds of them out there. And that content needs to evolve gracefully. Death taxes change. The terminology needs to have a clear, stated, public policy for change, for additions and for retirements or other sorts of changes that are appropriate to that terminology. Might be addition of attributes. And what if you need additional content? You know, this appears to be one of the $64,000 questions in this community. First of all is it actually in scope of the code system that you want to add it to? If not, if it's not in the stated scope, You've got to ask, am I using the right code system in the first place? Is it likely to see that through routine change you'll see it in the next release? My world of medicines, we've said already, changes very rapidly. And in theory, I would expect to see routine changes in the update of SNOMED. Just at the moment, their change management policy for that particular hierarchy isn't doing that. And I've got a mismatch between what I need and what the clear policy states for the overall code system and what's actually happening in the partition that I need to use. And that's a community issue. And that's where the community needs to the user community needs to badger the terminology owner. And part of the clear policy for change might be how you do that badgering. SNOMED obviously and LOINC and so forth have their formal change request process. And if that's coming from within HL7, the HTA for the external terminologies has a process for doing that. But I think there are some issues too around what are the boundaries of what we can put forward, particularly in the international terminologies. What does the code system say about changes, about the policy? And one of the things that the HTA is trying to do is build a set of information for those global code systems that allows you to see, and if we're not clear, to ask us to be clear about it. And even within our community, the HTA is responsible for changes to course, asking for changes to course SNOMED, but if you're using the IPS subset, it's a different team that have to make those changes. And it's, it's not easy. I think we're also in a difficult area for national terminologies. And it really very much depends on how organized your national digital health is. Some of us work in areas where it's very easy for national digital health authorities to manage national terminologies, either through SNOMED extension or through other mechanisms. And in other nations, not just the US, I will say. I work in other nations where it's not easy. There isn't clear national processes, and there's not clear roles for the HL7 affiliate, if there is one. And that's difficult. I haven't got any slides on how to manage that difficulty. I think at the moment it's still case by case, and once we've done several cases, we might have some patterns that we can take forward. Concept orientation and formal definition is another semina desiderata that I would sign up to big time. No redundancy, no ambiguity, no two representations of the same unit of thought with different codes. So semantic clarity for the machine and for the human. That can be achieved by two ways, by text, with all its nuancing, and a lot of our simple code systems have pieces of text, in which case, is there a strong editorial policy and a strict maintenance process? Or not? Or it can be by model, which requires relationships and defining attributes, relationships and possibly defining attributes, and it may require tooling. It doesn't always require tooling. You don't have to be at the level of SNOMED. But just because you have a model and relationships and defining attributes, don't think that you don't need an editorial policy as well. I have a lovely quote from Stuart Nelson, the father of the UMLS, from years ago when we were building one of the original medication models. And I particularly like symmetry in models, and at that point the US had a very linear model, and RX norm is just changing to be mirrored, balanced. So I have to say, after 25 years, I'm quite pleased. But Stuart Nelson's quote was that there is truth and beauty in the model, terminology model. All the messiness is managed in the editorial policy. If you can't see the editorial policy for your code system terminology online or in the public domain, I would be chary of using it. As a terminologist, I don't expect the bog standard user to have to dig into it, but I do expect the terminologist to be familiar with the editorial policies for the code systems that they're using. And you know, it's so easy to put those slides up. And it's so much harder to do. I think I'm certainly over the fingers of both hands and down on the toes of the number of terminologies that I have developed and sent on their way. And some of them I look back and think, oh my goodness, if I knew what I knew now, I wouldn't have done X, Y, and Z. It takes a significant amount of time, effort, and energy, both in the domain of terminology itself and of the expertise of the domain that the terminology is describing. So you've got those two overlapping things. Much harder. We've already heard, I think, from Mark and others, you have to reject the bucket concepts if you possibly can, because they change their meaning. And if you must use them, if you must use those code systems, for example, we all have to report our international morbidity and mortality using ICD, even if we collect it in a different system. But if you have to use that system in data gathering, you may wish to remove them from your value set to reduce the user's chance of picking a bucket concept, because their meaning does change over time, and you have to know, particularly if it's not elsewhere specified, well, what was specified at the time when not elsewhere specified was picked? They're not actually always obvious. It's very easy if the concept says cardiac condition NOS. But in one of the code systems that I use regularly, the ATC, the Atomic Therapeutic and Chemical Classification of Medicinal Substances, what actually, in truth, is a not otherwise specified concept, doesn't have NOS attached to it. It's sort of hydrocortisone in other forms, or hydrocortisone with other things. And they are out there in disguise.
I have a question about that. In cancer, we have some of the ICD-03 codes, for example. And maybe in SNOMED too, but I'm not sure. I'm pretty loud, maybe okay. But and so we have, for example, you might have malignant melanoma NOS, or you might have a much more specific type of melanoma. So my point is, it deals with granularity. So would you argue that malignant melanoma NOS, that's the most granular that you might be able to get, is a bad code?
Yes, I am arguing it's a bad code, because that NOS at a particular time means it wasn't any of these, it was that. And then when the code systems changed and there are more malignant melanoma codes, NOS is now that, but not that.
Well, see, I guess my interpretation of that, and maybe I'm wrong, was that it means we're not sure, we don't have the information to be able to get more granular. It doesn't mean that it doesn't match any of those.
But
maybe that may be a misunderstanding on my part.
Not otherwise specified, or not elsewhere classified, if in the other terminology is, we can't find it in this code system. It's not one of ours.
Okay. So that was maybe my misunderstanding of it.
Which goes to the fact these concepts are ambiguous.
Well, I have a question actually about that. Coding to the most specific code available. All right, so suppose you don't know if it's bacterial or viral pneumonia. So at some level, the physician assistant just puts pneumonia, right? And isn't that the same as not otherwise specified? It is not, because that's the most granular concept that is possible to ascribe at a given time.
Yeah. So if you're choosing any parent concept in any terminology that has a subsumption pattern, the is-a granularity, what you are choosing is, I can tell you that it's pneumonia. I either can't tell you or won't tell you whether it's viral or bacterial. Not that these are all those codes here, but one of them isn't suitable. It's that this is the level of granularity.
That's very idealized, and it has to do with open and closed world as well. I mean, possibly there are no other types of pneumonia. That's just I'm not a medical person. I suppose there's no other infectious agents that could give you that. But if there's other types of melanoma, that could certainly be the case that it's open world, and picking that term from a higher level means that we have not found the term, or it could mean we don't know the term. But it certainly, is ambiguous whether it's not otherwise specified. I picked it because I didn't see a child term that fit. Or I picked it because I don't know and I don't have the information. I think it could be both ways, and it's, as I say, like an open and closed world, whether or not the subterms are covering the entire universe of the super term, the parent term.
This is where we're back to 10,000 hours, and your understanding of how a terminology is going to be used in practice. I actually think it's about education of your users. You're going to somewhere where it's education of your users as well, and whether you're using what information you need to gather from them and how you help to do that. So to my mind, that's beyond what you're going to write in an IG, I think, compared to how we use terminology generally and how we teach use of terminology to our users. Now, Graham's going to come back to me on this.
Well, I'm just going to say that I think when you're writing an implementation guide, it's very rare that you're front-running a community to the point where you can tell the users how to pick codes, right? You might be in that position if you're running an institution or you're a vendor in a greenfield site, but most of the implementation guides, you already have operating business arrangements that you're trying to make interoperable, which means people already know how they choose their codes. And the NOS codes have been, not the NEC, but the NOS codes have been submerged into the value sets and the frameworks and the processes. And, I don't think the 10,000 hours thing is even relevant, because people with 100 hours of experience are doing this stuff out in practice land and not interested in having anyone else dictate to them. And so it's to me, the whole discussion is not the reality that we deal with. That's how I feel about it anyway.
So I'm not sure from the takeaway of that was whether you're in favour of NOS codes or not.
If I was defining a code system as a code system authority for, like, if I was in charge of SNOMED or something, then I would have an opinion. But I don't have an opinion, because I just don't think that's the world that we live in, that it even matters. We don't have control over the codes, that much control. Typically we're doing extensible codes. You'd never add a NOS to an extensible coding system, only you just did incredibly add NOS codes to the extensible value set by implication. It's very slippery slope.
So let's take a moment, because this is one of the core semino desiderata. Where do we find the NOS and NEC codes? Which code systems typically use them?
SNOMED and ICD.
ICD, typically. SNOMED has them because of ICD. What does ICD, I talked about what is the scope of a code system. What is it used for?
It's a classification.
It's a classification for the World Health Organization's morbidity and mortality statistics. And yes, I'm talking the idealized world, but that's what ICD is produced for. Hence, they have these bucket concepts. Semino was writing for healthcare systems and communication between individual healthcare practitioners.
You'll be so thrilled to know that in most of the world, ICD-10 is used for your problem list as well.
Oh, I know. I absolutely do know that. But, that's... and for most of them, they've put some sort of modification on it for the problem list. But, yes, I know. I'm trying to challenge, and I'm trying to encourage change. And part of encouraging change, as Graham knows well, is challenging the status quo. So while we're talking about drawing difficult lines in the sand, let's go to another one. Another of the golden oldies, just like Jim Semino, Chris Shute always talks about the line in the sand, the representation of context and what you put in the information model, so what you put in the resource, compared to what the terminology is going to offer you. And this is where we're going towards whoever asked about negation. It is a line in the sand. And the tide comes in and out and changes that line and washes it away, and you can remake it, and the tide will come in and wash it away again. It's probably never going to go away unless you totally bind your terminology and information model together inextricably. Which means that you have to get two communities with different views and different philosophies to come together and agree passionately. So, I'm not Miss World. I'm not offering to try and get world peace. I think we do have to deal with the reality here. And what I suggest is that we try to avoid the double positive. If the value is family, if the attribute is, the element is family history, don't choose the value that says family history of asthma, just choose the value, the unit of thought that's asthma. Don't double repeat the positive, have the double positive. It's better to have a double positive than a double negative, but I just think it confuses people, and if we can avoid it by value setting, then do. The common context issues are history of, and whether you just do the condition, the problem, as your unit of thought, or whether your unit of thought has history of asthma, family history of, and if you go to the condition resource, it's specified. You're expected to do the context in the terminology. I think if you go to the family member history resource, the context does not come from the terminology. Allergy to. There are similar issues in the allergy and intolerance resource, which has got a very detailed exemplar value set, which allows concepts both with context and without, currently. Negation, somebody asked about this, and it remains a nightmare. And there is a group working on this explicitly within, I think it's within the SNOMED on FHIR group, isn't it? But there's a specific ballot about negation. Why is it such a nightmare? Go on then, Graham. Why is it such a nightmare? Why do you think it's such a nightmare?
My honest opinion is that it's a nightmare because it's a misthought introduced by the reference model, forcing people to think about negation. In the FHIR context, we don't really think about negation. We think about how to say what you need to say. And Lisa asked about negation because Lisa mainly lives in CDA, and that's where you think about negation. That's honestly my view about negation. In the FHIR community, we talk about how do you need to say all of the things you need to say. And it doesn't make the discussion less complex, it makes it less confusing.
So your recommendation is in my allergy code to put no known allergies, because that's what I need to say.
Oh, look, it's not a simple discussion. It's been very educational to watch the Argonaut group work that over and try to come to terms with that. I think that's where they ended up. I'm not going to recommend something, but I'm just saying that we don't think of that as a negation discussion. We just think of that as how do you characterise your requirements and figure out how to meet your requirements.
Okay, so I'm going to be a little bolder. It is in blue. Oh, well, not as blue as it was. My personal recommendation, based on a paper I wrote with Deepak Kalra when I was his PhD student, is to use the terminology reasonably exclusively, so not to put it in the information model. But the terminology doesn't always have the concepts to support that. Peter?
That's all fine, but that means you've got to create a negation concept for every single condition or allergy. And that's the same with putting any context around the terminology. You're going to run into that problem with it.
Yeah.
So the $64,000 question is, how do you solve that?
Isn't the $64,000 question is whether you need to solve that?
Peter thinks you do.
Well, I think you do. You need to say whether the person has the allergy or they don't have the allergy.
Well, okay, my opinion on allergies specifically is that in all of the institutions I've ever seen, we have two different sets of two different things. We have a list of things you are positively known to be allergic to, and some specific broad spectrum denials of
no known allergies.
Allergies either to any kind of things or to some specific things, all of which are somewhat broad. For instance, not allergic to latex or not allergic to X. But they're always very broad spectrum classification kind of behaviours. It's my opinion.
Lloyd's after you.
One of the challenges here is that the model is often created independent of any terminology because the terminology is expected to vary by context. And so the model has to support a variety of terminological capabilities because some terminologies will be able to and some won't. And there's a need to express the concept regardless. And then there's a pressure to express the concept consistently in the model, regardless of what terminology you're using. So it's messy. So
even amongst this community, we have differences.
So, I mean, my favourite example of this really simple example, when you order an imaging study, in practice, you need to specify two things. You need to specify the modality and the body site that's being imaged. And if in Australia, where I can speak to this confidently, about half the institutions offer people a set of order codes which are pre-coordinated, and half the institutions offer people a set of order codes which are split into two parts, the modality and the body site. And we have to make that interoperable. And that's like a really practical example without needing post-coordination or or you know, grammars or anything in SNOMED. It's just you get two different lists, one which does combine them, and then one where you've got two separate lists. And that is a ubiquitous issue that will all often come up when a community's figuring out how they're going to phrase their implementation code.
Well, that actually is your line in the sand. That's exactly, you know, two attributes or a pre-coordinated pair. It's exactly your line in the sand. It's not negation, it's your line in the sand.
Well, I mean, the community will be combined with people who have different opinions about this.
Exactly, and what I was saying, the tide comes in and the tide goes out.
So the typical resources where this arises are observation, condition, request, service request, allergy intolerance, adverse event, and some of the billing ones.
So, I mean, one of the, I'll go back to it. I'm not standing here providing, as you can tell, all the answers. I'm pulling out some of the challenges and encouraging the community to continue to work and to negotiate. I think one of the reasons why negation is a nightmare is not just technical, it is for the practical healthcare considerations. Is if we get negation wrong, we can really damage patients, and it tends to make particularly clinicians quite jumpy, understandably. And a double positive is fine, a double negative actually ends up being a positive, even in mathematics, which is a problem. Mark?
Yeah, the language isn't bad in this case. You know, we started out by saying the natural language is not computable, but actually the language is
in this it is
very much more tractable than coding. So I'm wondering if we've manufactured a problem.
Interesting thought. If it is known allergies, yes, I think the language is clear. It's not always that clear. It can be more subtle.
I guess I'm thinking of, I'm sure the language can get much more subtle, but I'm thinking about physical exam results or radiology results where, you know, no sign of is a very common way to express results. And pertinent negatives, the ones that are actually important for diagnosis and treatment, are very poorly represented in records. We know that. But in notes, it's almost trivial. I mean, you look at any diagnostic report, and the text will have a whole bunch of pertinent negatives. So I think in this case, actually, we've created the problem out of whole cloth. We think that coding is going to help us in solving computability problems. I mean, talk to Clem McDonald. He wonders out loud whether or not coding is actually going to be with us for very long, and whether natural language will take over. And here's a case where, you know, coding just doesn't seem to work that well.
Yes, and natural language gives you a whole heap of other problems. Do people are they expressing that language in the correct grammar? You know, situations with explicit context negation. You trying to reverse engineer those back into codings, and that's where the NLP parsers have a great deal of difficulty. I mean, does a GP in a 15-minute consultation express his thoughts in grammatically correct English? You know, can he pick out the subjects and objects of these sentences correctly, and et cetera, et cetera. I think Lloyd made a good point earlier about the information model. Sometimes you've got this danger of the information being taken out of that context and used, which I guess is where the double positive helps, because it slightly helps you, and putting negation in the terminology helps you in that situation. But then again, you could say you should never take it outside of that context. Because I mean, no allergies means nothing without more context around it, because it's a very much a point in time observation that could have changed the day after.
As could every observation, but yes. I think, you know, one of my takeaways from this is, if I truly believe if I truly believe what I did back whenever I wrote this paper with Deepak, that the terminology should do this, is how can the terminology model do it better so that it's easier to extract from a model terminology those things that are these negated concepts, particularly when you've got isers. You know, you cannot have no known allergies in an intolerance subsumption hierarchy. It doesn't make sense. And what can we do within terminology to manage those better and actually to allow them to be pulled out and used in systems better? So that's a takeaway challenge in a sense for myself. Concept permanence, the meaning once released, which means you need good QA before you release, a concept's meaning does not change. And I think we've talked about this an awful lot around the versioning and what you do with historic data and so on. Very simply, analysis and reuse use cases are severely compromised if you don't have concept permanence. But we've also discussed in this group what actually permanence really means. And has the term heavy smoker, has the concept that is in our heads of heavy smoker changed in 20 years as smoking patterns have changed? And being familiar with the terminology's editorial guidance on this is particularly important with what they will and won't allow to change. The non-semantic concept identifier, we've talked about putting terminologies and value sets in particular in spreadsheets. And it seems a really simple thing, doesn't it? The non-semantic concept identifier. When we first started using coded data in GP systems in the UK, and bear in mind our GPs now are paid based on the data that they put in, not in a 15-minute consultation, but in an 8-minute consultation, and one of my daughters is a GP. We had some interesting data. Bear in mind, this was the late 90s, before every teenager was decorated. And we had a code value that was tapped. And we saw an enormous number of middle-aged women having problems with tattoos. That was really weird. And it took some while before we realized that GPs were picking the code that was TATT for tattoo, thinking actually it was tired all the time. Non-semantic concept identifiers for the machine. And data quality going down while people actually learn how to use it. And that is a real example, honest. In the Semino desiderata, there's this, Jim says that this whole thing about polyhierarchy and a direct acyclic graph, the complexity of allowing clinical concepts to have multiple parents, have multiple relationships, and this unlimited depth of hierarchy. You know, this is a desiderata. This is desired in his view. And I think for some things, I agree with him. For everything? No, I seriously don't. The medication model that we've just done for SNOMED has a fixed level of granularity in what will be published in the core. There will be opportunities for different levels of recursion because we need to in practice, but it's still actually a fairly fixed level with, at the lower levels, quite fixed inheritances, because that's what's practical and that's what the community needs. And this can be quite hard to implement, and particularly, I'm not sure if it's this slide or in the next one, in your value sets, you need to be really careful that you're not, particularly if they're extensionally defined, that because of this polyhierarchy, which can be difficult to see, you're not suddenly picking in a whole set of concepts into your value set that you didn't think you were getting. And suddenly a value set that you thought had 50 concepts in has got 250, and you go, whoa, where did they come from? And it may well be because of a polyhierarchy that wasn't easy to see. Because this, no matter how we do it, is not easy to put onto a screen and let users to use intuitively. So that was a quick run through of the Semino desiderata. And the implications of that, back to my 10,000 hours, the organization providing the code system, particularly if it's a complex one, needs to have significant terminology expertise and significant domain expertise in the areas in which it's working with, which is, I think, one of the great values of LOINC, particularly in core LOINC. And the organisation needs to be stable and committed to the long game, which is hard to do in the 21st century. I've talked already about your code system needs to be compatible to its use case. And I'll pick up again on ATC here. You don't need to see the detail of this, but the ATC on its main pages, on what we might consider it to be its canonical URL, said that it's around drug utilization statistics with the aim of improving drug use. Jose will know that one of the big European projects for prescribing tried to use ATC as our medicinal substance description. Was that right? Yes. You can't see Jose grimacing like this. We were trying to use, in a big international communication project at implementation guidance level, a code system that is not compatible with its stated use. I'm surprised it didn't work. You need to understand a complex terminology. I've got 3 codes here for SNOMED CT, and they are all, certainly at preferred term level, amoxicillin, and they're all different. And it's one of the reasons for when the global patient set that's just come out from SNOMED, the free subset, which you might wish to look at for free SNOMED codes that anyone can use, not just those of us that are in countries that have got a SNOMED license. We, the HTA, said to them, please will you put the fully specified name in, not just publish the code in the preferred term, which is what they originally planned to do. You would not have known which of these 3 is which. And I didn't put it in the slide. This is the substance. This is the medicinal product containing. And this is the medicinal product only. I don't know if you heard it earlier, but Mark referred to something called open world and closed world, the universal or existential restriction in SNOMED CT. And if you don't know what that means, you are very lucky. It's horrible. In my world of medicines, it happens to be vital. Because this concept says a medicinal product containing amoxicillin. And anything else that we haven't told you about could contain diamorphine, could contain clavulanic acid, which standardly goes with amoxicillin. But we don't know. It's the open world assumption. Are you going to put that in a prescribing subset? Heck no. And we've had to build some complex logic to get a concept that is amoxicillin only, which is when I say, please give this patient amoxicillin, you give them amoxicillin, not amoxicillin and anything else you happen to have handy. And unless you understand the depths of the model of those concepts, I think it's very difficult to know which sorts of concepts you would pick for your value set. Similarly, in LOINC, there are differences between those things that are tests and those things that are substrates. And just looking at the text without looking at the context within the code system, never mind the context within the resource or information model, that can be a challenge. When we're dealing with UIs, you can do things to help this, and Graham pointed that out earlier. In IGs, you've just got to manage this carefully and pick the right things. And it's not just a quick read of the guide, I'm sorry. And even if you do have a quick read of the SNOMED guide, you'll still go, what? Is the data that you think is a code system actually a code system? And this is one that came to me came to my attention via the Zulip chat. Somebody was asking about the DEA drug scheduling for controlled substances in the US, and actually asking for sort of, is this a code system? No, it's not. It's a web page dealing with, dealing with units of thought. Absolutely. Each of these 5 schedules is a unit of thought in the domain of managing substances of misuse. But it's not a code system because there are no concept identifiers, and there's no one managing to put these out as a set of concept identifiers. So what can you do? Well, eventually it dawned on me, actually, there will be someone who has put these into a code system, because this is, if this was a UK problem, I know where I'd go. I'd go to our national medicines terminology, where we have things like this. Of course we do, all nations do. And they have taken on to be a code system authority for this business need, and said, we will take this government guidance and make it into part of our code system. And so here are the codes and their concept representations. So I then thought, well, who might have done this in the US? Actually, NCPDP might have done, but the one that came to mind is the NCI Thesaurus. And sure enough, there are 5 codes within the NCI Thesaurus that exactly capture these units of thought. So if your value set needs these 5 things, you can use the NCI Thesaurus as a code system and get a 5 concept value set to do that. That needs domain knowledge. That needs vocabulary facilitation if you yourself haven't got the domain knowledge, which is back to, please, reach out. And the discussion I was having with Graham at break time, which is in the newer world, the different world of how we're working now, is there anything that needs to change around that so you can get your paws on that, that sort of domain knowledge? But I will put a rider out there, and again, I'm sorry it's poking at Canada, where as vocab facilitator for pharmacy, several years ago in V3, I spent hours sorting out sets of concepts that were brought to harmonization, because I needed to sort through the business need, and then actually to work out if we'd got something already, or whether this was something that was justifiable to add in those days to the HL7 code systems, because they were about business process of messaging, actually, and the good old things of what the receiver responsibilities were in a particular dynamic context, which is all about business process. And after sort of, I don't know, 4 sets of harmonization cycle, each of which took between 5 and 10 hours each, I was like, goodness me, this is an awful lot to be doing, in a sense, in a voluntary context to work through. So there may be some negotiation there with your vocabulary facilitator. So, I mean, I don't have any worked examples really in this presentation, because I knew we were in a big goop. But one of the things that we capture in identification of medicinal products is their colour, and it's particularly used when the casualty, the A&E doc, no, what do you call them? The emergency room doctor is presented with a handful of tablets and said the patient's just taken 20 of these, and you look and right, I haven't got a clue. One of the first things you'll do is what the colour is. What sort of code system? So this is still a healthcare concept. What might you use for a code system for colour? Where might you start? Pantone. And why would you use that, Mark?
Well, I think it is a well-curated code system, but there's thousands of codes there that I can't, by my male eyes, tell the difference. But it's the only one I know that really has.
Okay, Pantone. Before I press the button, can anyone give me another one? There is another one out there. There's RAL. Very similar to Pantone, and there is a RAL to Pantone mapping. What else? So those two, did I write this down? Bother, I didn't write it down. You're going to have to trust my memory. One of them is for paints, and the other is, oh no, I have forgotten. I knew I should have written it down. But, they're not healthcare. Sorry.
Yeah, it's also not healthcare related, but it's a general question of mine. For example, RGB. It's not a finite system, but it's kind of grammar. Is it a code system?
RGB. Is that a colour one? Oh, red, green, blue.
Yeah.
Yes.
With all the percentages.
Well, I think you'll find that actually goes back to RAL.
Yeah. To me, sometimes the border between the differentiation between the grammar and the code system is hard to do.
The syntax of building a piece of information.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the line in the sand, the information model. What else? So those two are out there in the world for colour, and they're great, but their granularity is enormous, but they do have good definition right down to their red, green, blue indexes. I don't think it does. Sorry. But I talked about this being for a medicinal product. Who regulates your medicinal products here in the US? FDA. Where do they put most of their code systems? In the NCI thesaurus. Heck, if you go to the NCI thesaurus, there's a whole load of color terms to work with the SPL product label. Sorry, Drugway?
Primary source. They post it themselves.
They post them themselves, but if you...
Thesaurus picks them up.
The thesaurus picks them up, and you could refer to them there. So, two external, well-known, one healthcare. What would govern your choices? Mark said there's excellent granularity, and that's very true. Do you need granularity?
Not that much. In fact, the variation in manufacturing of colors is way higher than the Pantone granularity. So beige would be,
Trust me, I've just chosen a screen for my kitchen, and the guy came with the Dulux, and it was this thick, and I'm like, can I have that one? It's beautiful. What else? Context. What do I need to capture, which we'll do with granularity. Who owns these three? Can we use these two free of charge? We know we can use the NCI thesaurus free of charge. Do we know? Should we know? You've got to ask those questions before you actually even look to see if they will meet your use case. Particularly when we're going outside of healthcare. And we will. We're currently thinking about what on earth the actual true licensing agreement for the ISO country codes is. We might not like the answer. So, the criteria to consider, we said content and granularity. We said the domain use statement, and I wondered if I'd got the notes for those two code systems for colors, and I haven't. I shall go back. The definition of the concepts for both RAL and Pantone, they will give you the RGB spectrum. The NCI, it's just blue, pale blue, green. It's back to your, in a sense, adjectival description. And the availability and ownership and license. And whether it can be internationally or nationally used. There's nothing to stop, and for this I am very grateful, there's nothing to stop me in the UK from, in a UK implementation guide, referencing a value set taken entirely from the NCI thesaurus, which is, it's one of the strengths of that sort of thing. And also, sorry.
So there's a color code system called APA that's used a lot in PCMC, scale. Is that not a code system because it's a scale? It's a numeric value for what the color is?
I don't know the code system. I don't know the example. So it's a scale.
Yes, it's a scale. It's, so basically you test a drug, and a lot of times it will be like a substance, and sometimes people will do, you're testing a pill, and you manufacture the pill, and most of the time it's really substance, so like every once in a while you do a pill. But basically it's an actual scale, and you measure it, and it's cobalt units is like how it's measured, and then you have a number value. So is that not a code system because it's a scale?
Okay. So it's a number value.
Number value for indicating color.
So that would be a different data type. That would be a physical quantity, a value and units.
Okay, so it's not a code.
So it's not a code. But can you hear how sometimes you have to dig at something that think, oh, hold on a minute, that's a code system. Actually, no, it's not. It's a value with units. It's a physical thing. But, in the good old things where you do urinalysis, is protein present plus, code system. Symbols, code system. Oh yes, what's been stated in the, what does the exemplar binding? If someone's done the work for you and it's good enough, reuse it. There's plenty of new things we can make mistakes on. For the FHIR-specific code systems, this is probably the source of truth, especially if you're dealing with the code data type. The FHIR code system registry is where you need to go. And just as we talked about the code and the concepts that go with it, the units of thought, the bits of data that go with it, check carefully that it meets your requirements. For external code systems, maybe. Internal, external. Again, the debate, constant debate. If nobody's doing this, can't we just do it ourselves? Can we author and maintain this by some part of the HL7 community? Yes, we can. But what do we need to do it? We need the long view, we need terminology expertise, and we need domain expertise. But, Wayne, if we're going to do this, we need the long view. You can't do it for 5 years and then stop. It has to be something that you carry on. It's like children. Once you've got them, they're always with you. I remember seeing Hugh's 70-year-old dad dealing with Hugh at a time of family crisis and just watching him and being gobsmacked that you never stop being a parent. If you author a code system, it is yours forever. It's the same commitment, guys. So there are positives and negatives of having an internal code system. We do have control of the content. We can probably change reasonably quickly. And we have the universal terminology governance processes and tooling. Do we have the domain expertise? Do we have the resources now and in the future? So, sorry, I'll go back to that one. It is not something to take on lightly. But if the world out there is not doing what you need, it will be a decision that you have to make. So, if you have an element, and I'm changing tack here slightly, if you have an element of called diagnosis, what are your possible candidates? Where would you go? Come on, we've talked about it loads. Shout it out. SNOMED CT. ICD-10. I've mentioned MEDRA because that's in my world. Whoops, wrong slide. Wrong button. ICPC, if you're in Europe, the International Classification of Primary Care. And there are others out there. So, how are you going to choose? Do they all adhere to the desiderata? Yes? No? Maybe? Pretty much. Both MEDRA and ICD-10 are classifications. ICD, we know, has the bucket concepts. But otherwise, yes, they adhere to the desiderata. They've got, SNOMED CT particularly, it's got very good scope for the healthcare domain, particularly for that describing the process of care. It's highly modelled in most areas, so it needs significant expertise to use well. It obviously has polyhierarchy, and we talked about whether that was a good or bad thing. It contains knowledge as well as these units of thought. And for some use cases, that can be brilliant. For others, it might be a hindrance. If we take allergic to latex, I think that was a code someone's talked about already, there should be a link in the knowledge part of SNOMED from that unit of thought, allergy to latex, through to the unit of thought that just describes latex as a substance. That means if you have decision support that looks at the substances involved in a device, for example, you should be able to see whenever there's a latex device and say, oh, don't use that for this patient. So you're going beyond the units of thought into knowledge about those units of thought, and that might be really valuable to your use case. Or it might just model it up. And to be fair, not all areas of SNOMED are modelled to the quality of others. And although I've just given you that medical device use case, it won't work just yet. But for drugs it would, or will. And it supports post-coordination. It allows users to build new things. It requires a license for use. Its core isn't nation-specific. So for medicines, you can't use just SNOMED CT in the US, and in fact, your terminology of choice is RX norm. But even in my world, where SNOMED CT does do our medicines, I can't use core SNOMED. I've got to use our national extension to pull everything in. And therefore, I've got to identify it differently because it will version differently and have different identifiers. So it's not just as simple as saying, heck, I can use SNOMED CT. ICD-10 adheres to the desiderata mostly, but as we've said so often, it's primarily a classification for morbidity and mortality. It also has a post-coordination syntax, which I've never quite got my head around, the wonderful dagger asterisk pattern, which allows hospital coders to code the primarily thing that killed you and the subsidiary causes to that. And its scope is much more limited. So, you know, I talked about an element for diagnosis or problem, but it's got diseases, conditions, and injuries, so it's pretty much the scope you'd want for diagnosis. And it's very clearly multilingual in all facets, whereas SNOMED multilinguicity is more complex. MEDRA, scope, although it also has lab tests, but qualitatively. So you can say that someone's had a thyroid function test and you can say that their thyroid function is raised. It's a bit weird like that. Its main use is in reporting adverse events in the regulatory environment, and it's a very rigid classification without the ability to do a post-coordination syntax. But you know, for the area that it works in, which is reporting adverse events, it's very good indeed. And it has an extremely well-qualified maintenance organization and set of SMEs that back it up. Mark?
So you're arguing these on the merits of the terminology or the code system?
I think I am.
But you know, when we did an IG, the thing that was controlling was what was used in practice. I mean, it's just like we want to not use ICD-03 because it hasn't been updated since I don't know when. But in cancer, that's used, right? That's used. And we'd like to use SNOMED because it has more, it fulfills more of the concepts of an ideal terminology, but it's not used. I mean, people use ICD-10, and they use CPT, and they use the things that they use. So there's this idealism on one hand, and there's this realism on the other hand. And if you want your IG to be adopted, I would suggest that realism is the thing that you need to embrace. And this meant that we made a heck of a lot, well, in several of the IGs that I've worked on, we've made a heck of a lot of compromises. And it doesn't make analysis easier to say, oh, well, use one of these 3 or 4 code systems or code sets, value sets, you know, from different vocabularies, but that's what we're going to get until someone pays the systems to make a change. And I know what you're going to say next. It's expensive.
I'm not actually. I'm going to say carrots and sticks. You need carrots and sticks, which is beyond us here to implement, unfortunately. So yes, I understand the pragmatism of what you're working in. And yes, I know I'm an idealist. I accept that. I hope I'm a pragmatic idealist, but if I have to choose, I'm probably more of an idealist than a pragmatist. And the way that I have seen change is through those carrots and sticks. But some of us here will, I believe, some of you here will have the opportunity to be in discussion with the people that do have the carrots and sticks. Carrots are really good. You know, that's what's changed general practice in the UK. If you code your diagnoses, you can be paid. I'll code my diagnoses. Sticks. If you want to submit your adverse events, and boy, you won't get a license unless you do, you will use this code system because it's a good code system for your use case. And I have to say the FDA hasn't come down entirely on support of this. They still accept adverse event reports with the old WHOART and JART, well, particularly WHOART system, but almost nowhere else in the world does. So I understand, and yeah, I am the idealist, but I am also here to challenge and encourage. And I do believe that some of you will have the opportunities to push for change. Jose?
A question, I was saving it for later, but it relates to this topic. As we are making implementation guides, we also have our share of responsibilities to say what are we pushing forward. So if we expect things to be governed upstream, then we are doing our job to say we took care of this, we looked at all the preconditions and what we should do, so we are pushing it forward to you, user, to use this properly. So I understand the problem that, in my words, the world out there is a mess, so I think we have to be very careful to say, okay, do we adhere to that mess and then where is it going to end? Or do we say, let's just do something that can make this a bit better, because we are offering it implementation guidance. We want it to be guidance and not adherence.
And you know, if I can hold out the ideal, hold out the vision, each of you can choose which bit of it you do or don't buy into, which fights you do or don't want to go in for. And if you're still using ICD 03, that might be one that you think, come on guys, this is time to move forward. Whereas actually, is the resource implication to go to SNOMED CT worth it? It might not be. What I'm aiming to do is to give you, in a sense, a degree of security, and I can stand here and actually argue my point, even perhaps if nobody listens. One day, they might. Quick plug for the HL7 Confluence pages. We are trying to be more relevant to the needs of the organization in giving information about external code systems. Right, I'm going to run through this really quickly because you've been here for hours and you must be bored silly. Why bother with value sets? Why not let the user have free choice from the code system? And the classic one is that you need more than one code system in order to describe things. Allergy to or intolerance to a particular allergen, well known, foods, drugs, and pollen, natural substances like latex pollens. Although SNOMED CT will cover those, as we've already said, you won't get the actual branded medicine in your jurisdiction. And that won't include foods or other allergens. So it is likely that you will need to build your value set from either more than one code system or certainly different parts of the SNOMED code system. And surprise, surprise, that's exactly what the allergy and intolerance resource does. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, including that lovely negated no known allergy. So that's a classic example. And if I was doing that in my implementation back in the UK, the drug part would need to reference my national terminology. For you in the US, it would have to reference, because it's in your regulations, RX norm. So that's the point of a value set drawing from more than one code system. How you then work it with that nuance of the extensible, I think to me this is about no one code system provides the known set of units of thought that we know and that the community agrees that we need to use. And so my value set definition must draw from more than one code system. And it's very important that you don't get overlap, so that you're getting the same unit of thought from both code systems into that value set, because implementers, it's just like having semantic ambiguity. The second reason for using value sets is where you are doing data analysis, and knowing what the value set that was used is really important. Very simple and silly example. 50 people were asked to indicate their favorite color. In surveys, the first survey, 17 people said blue, but in the second survey, only 4 people. Was this because they're from some strange population group that can't see blue, or that has a conceptual dislike to it because it's a bad luck color? No, it's because the value sets themselves were significantly different. The first survey only gave them 4 choices. The second survey gave them this lot with vast amounts of definition around it. And if all I know is the code system, not the value set, I can't actually do a significant amount of analysis on that. So for me, this is very much a clinical research type example. But it's probably true as well if you're comparing different sets of healthcare data, where two insurance companies have two separate sets of billing codes. Knowing the value sets that support each of those will affect the way that you can analyze the data that you're getting back from those two data sets. We've talked about concept granularity being balanced with my family pets example. It's the CLD is really important here, not just to identify the value set of the value set itself, but also the version of the value set, if that's allowed to change over time. Right. I did rather whisk through that last bit. I have got to the end of the set of things that I was planning to talk about. My summary is that I hope that you are really confident in the basic principles, not just to apply them, but maybe also to fight for them. That you have a working understanding of the considerations for code system selection, what and why, and similarly for value sets. But Graham thinks there's some more things we need to do.
Always. So I have a question for you. So a little bit of background to set the scene for the question. I've just been sitting at the back here searching through all of the IGs that we've published through HL7 infrastructure and looking at all the code systems that we've defined in the implementation guides that we've published. And there's some where the implementation guide is evidently publishing enumerations from somebody's internal model which are clearly overlapping with concepts defined in SNOMED, QI core. But then there's others where really what we're doing is we're defining little classifications that relate to the workflows established by the implementation guides. So we're not doing diagnosis or allergy intolerance because that's where Mark is right. That's already pre-selected by massive systems. You know, in Australia, they've been trying for 20 years to shift these systems, and so far one of them's changed. These are very inflexible arrangements. But so when we define code systems, we've actually, so the other thing that we do is we publish code systems that other people have defined, but informally. And so then we sit down and say, well, we need to actually do this as a formal code system. And so we actually, there's quite a few where somebody's published a list of codes and we've actually formalised that and published it as a code
They're
system.
not a list of codes though, Graham. They're a list of units of thought.
That would be a fun discussion that we could have at some stage. But what someone has published a list of codes that may or may not have some thought behind them, and we have to actually exchange them. So we published them as a code system, but we didn't set out to claim that we, did the definition, and the definition says where they came from. But then there's, probably 30 or 40 code systems that we've published that were developed with the implementation guide, and it really are roughly classifications that drive decisions made by the people engaging in the interactions defined by the implementation guide. Now you said and talked about adopting children, because that goes really well, and that was the price. I want to poke on that and ask you whether you think that there's a difference between taking on an implementation guide and taking on code systems that are tied to the implementation guide like I've just described.
Simple answer? No, I don't think there's a difference. I think a code system is a code system. And what you're describing, I believe, if I've understood you correctly, is a set of units of thought that capture the business process of a particular communication and support what in the old days were things like trigger events and receiver responsibilities, but a part of that business process of communication that are specific to the way the community has defined that FHIR will work. And to me, that is the responsibility of FHIR, and those are your children. And you have the domain expertise, and you therefore have the responsibility to manage those units of thought for the time that those units of thought are needed, which may be from here in perpetuity.
Okay, thank you. So if I was going to look at some of those and say, but HL7's general recommendation is that we should avoid defining code systems, where are the kind of places I would look, and what would I look for if I thought that I wanted to avoid defining my own code system for those kind of codes?
Well, can we go back to the domain and scope? The domain and scope and the domain expertise for those codes that you are talking about sounds to me like it lives in HL7. So those are not codes that I personally, those are not units of thought that I would expect anyone else but HL7 to manage. I don't think I have ever argued that everything should be an external code system.
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, and I'm sort of labouring this because I think it's very much the IG question. The need for some kind of exchange arises out of a ecosystem where there's a variety of controlling factors, some regulation that establishes implicit codes in the regulation, law that does so in association with hundreds of words rather than, you know, a crisp definition, billing authorities defining categories, and so a lot of these, the concepts actually arise externally, although the codes, the units of thought, not so much. And I think that's kind of what led us to here is where, you know, people who actually face the problem of sorting this out feel underprepared for doing this. And what, you know, you've done a very good review of the theory and the and some of the considerations, but I feel as though we still haven't yet figured out a community or a process or something. I'm not sure now where I'm heading, but I feel as though we're not there yet.
So if we're not sure where we're heading, it's going to be difficult to know when we've got there. But what I think you're picking out there is a set of things that are not within the domain of the mechanisms of FHIR, but they are within the domain of the different implementation guides. So they are domain specific in billing or in
pre-authorization.
Pre-authorization. But there is nobody who gives them a formal, makes them into a formal code system at the moment. There's no one within the domain that you know of. So if I take the DEA codes, we could find someone who was in the domain, who actually took that regulation and made it into codes within a code system. And what you're arguing is that for billing and for pre-authorization, for a whole load of other things, there's no equivalent that's doing that, as far as we know. Is that right?
I'm not so much arguing that there is none, just that I don't know, like we don't have any written guidance or even any community sense of how you would find them and how you would decide whether they qualified as a code system authority or not. I mean, we have a very clear definition of code system authority when we come to dealing with, you know, WHO and SNOMED and so forth, but we're...
No, I would argue that we have looked this morning at what you need to be a code system, you need to be a managed collection of concept representations and have set yourself up to do that. And if you just put a web page out with 5 units of thought, you very clearly haven't set yourself up to do that. If you're an insurance company that says, these are the 10 things that we will accept a payment for, then actually you have set yourself up to be an authority to do that.
So I don't think, I mean, I follow your logical train of thought there, but I don't think we've written that down anywhere. Yeah?
Oh dear.
I don't think we, I might be wrong. We've written such a lot down that I could always be wrong, but do you know of written that down somewhere in that sense?
No, and I've often, and I agree with you, I sometimes think, oh goodness, how much more should we write? Will you read it if we write it? One of the things I get pushback from so often from people like you is, yes, Julie, you can write it, but actually nobody's going to read it.
Well, you know, we do.
Will you read it if I write it, Graham?
So part of it is how it's indexed, but if we have, you know, we have a homepage for implementation guide writing, which I at least know, and Lloyd knows, and then when people ask, we actually refer them to them. We do this with everything else, and so the answer is yes if it's somewhere that we know where it is. And that's basically how this stuff works else in the other parts of what we do, is a small group of us know where stuff is and can point other people to it and do so.
And in a sense, that's why I was pushing, you know, vocabulary facilitators. And I suspect I'm pushing something that's an extremely imperfect system. But, you know, there must be in HL7 people who are billing and whatever experts and can point you to those code systems.
So I know that many of the people in the room here are not HL7 insiders who probably don't understand what a vocabulary facilitator is. So perhaps you could spend a minute expanding on how that is supposed to work now. And the thing is, you know, partly what we're doing here is growing the community, and we haven't really talked about how to grow that system, but you could at least describe what it is.
I can try, on the basis that I am one. For any development project or work group, well, any work group, and then any project within a work group, and Melva is sitting here and she's really hot on process, so tell me when I get it wrong. You are supposed to have various facilitators, one of whom is your vocabulary facilitator. And that is supposed to be a person who is willing, who has domain expertise and terminology expertise, and who is willing to accept requests from you and help you find the right thing. And you know, once if you're writing an IG, we'll go through your IG and say, you know, yes, no, or that sort of thing for your implementation guidance. Am I roughly on the right track, Melva? Oh, good, yes. And
so if you're working on an IG project that's officially an HL7 project, you should have a committee that's actually involved in what you're doing. Should. And if they are, then you should have a vocabulary facilitator who's usefully engaged in what you're doing. If you do not, or if the project you're working on is an IAG project or is outside HL7, I don't believe that IAG, for instance, has a formal vocabulary process.
No, I don't think it does.
You, I guess, fall back on asking questions on chat.fhir.org in the IG creation channel, where we will drag in whoever we think is the appropriate person. But I think that Julie's totally correct, is that this is, you need help with this. The kind of skills that we mainly choose implementation guide editors and authors for is not, there's not enough people, there's very few people who have those skills and extensive terminology skills.
And also, you know, we were talking earlier about the need to evolve and to evolve gracefully. I know in HTA, I feel that if I get requests for new concepts and they're not actually to support HL7 artifacts, I'm almost outside of my remit as the HL7 terminology authority to deal with them. You know, if I go to SNOMED with a request and I can't actually say whether, you know, I'm walking on thin ice.
Yeah, so for instance, that's kind of funny because yesterday I was talking to Richard Esmond about the SNOMED extension jointly used by HSBC, CIMI, and somebody else. So it's Key Solar, yeah.
Solar.
And I was thinking about that and the way that that's maintained and the relationship with the HL7 process. It's sort of outside HL7, but it's sort of not. So it's an interesting question.
I haven't got a clue, yeah.
So I was just going to comment, yesterday we talked about process and the community building process and why it's important to engage. So if you come into HL7 and a work group is sponsored or there are co-sponsors, make use of that domain expertise. So it's always problematic if you develop outside content, come back to the work group, you know, the day that the QA final content is deadline and ask them to review, but then they start asking questions. So the earlier you engage with that work group, there's a reason you're at that work group. They're the domain experts, and so engage with them and bring your content to them and those questions sooner than later so you don't kind of get negative balloted at the end. But that's what they're there for, and use that process.
And, you know, if you ask me as someone, Hugh and I were calculating how many hours we've spent in American immigration security checks as we queue. Over the 20 years we've been coming to HL7 meetings, and for quite a lot of that time at our own expense, which for a couple, yeah, we can share the hotel room, but, you know, it's quite challenging. It's actually because this community is my continuing education. There is nowhere else in the world, really, that challenges my brain, which admittedly is getting a bit old at 56, to the level that this community does. There is enormous value in this community, not just for getting your IGs done, but for your own personal development. And I can see Lynn looking at me. I suspect we should be wrapping up. And I have just 2 more slides that I would really like to show, which are part of this. To build anything of lasting quality that enhances our life, I really believe you need vision, you need time, effort, resources, and expertise. And I'm really sorry if you don't have some of those, and you're building under pressure, and you're under-resourced. We tend to go to chaos. Nobody sets out to build favelas. Nobody sets out to build badly. It just happens when there's pressure, lack of vision, lack of resource, and lack of expertise. So when you build your IGs and your resources and everything, please keep your vision clear and invest sensibly. Please use terminology wisely, and it will serve you well. Yes, we've uncovered some of the horrible things that are still not perfect, and it is Cinderella, and I do honestly feel that quite a lot of the time I'm grubbying around in the soot in the chimney in the fireplace. But my vision is out there. One day I will wear that ball gown. We will build better terminologies. We will avoid the shortcuts. We will take them on as our children and parent them for life, because we have to. Maybe I will rewrite Jim Smino's Desiderata. We do need to go forward and build really high quality systems. So thank you very much for giving your Friday morning. I hope it has been encouraging and challenging, and I will take questions. And thank you, Graham and Lloyd, actually for asking me to do this and being willing to take the risk, because I know I'm a bit of an iconoclast. Thank you very much indeed.
Questions?
Yeah, oh, go on, Jose, go on.
If we don't, then we don't. I'll ask separately.
Good job, I know you.
Yeah, so I'm thinking that as we are, so for example, we are working in IHE and we want to have more people doing implementation guides and writing stuff in good quality. You mentioned what for me was actually a very good point that I take out of this is it's not just talk to the right people, it's talk to the right people that will do a couple of these things. So I'm seeing some checklists, some bullet points there that people should follow. Is there more of these? Should we develop more of these that people anywhere, if they did not come to this meeting, they are still aware that at least this and this and this check?
I think that's something that Graham is really pushing at. And my feedback is, if I do it, will you read it? Because the last thing one wants to do is waste time. But if it's valuable, and maybe you as a community start to say that that's valuable, then yes, we will. But I'll go back to my 10,000 hours. Work alongside someone. Get them to teach you. I could see people in this room that already have that expertise. Get alongside them. Get them to teach you. And that, do it with someone, do it on your own. And at least, I'm sure Mark, for example, and I know I'm very willing to share my mistakes because there are plenty of new ones out there for you to make. But please don't make the mistakes of our past. So as well as documentation, I actually think it's the partnership working. It's one-on-one or small group, and then you go on and feed them back into your institutions. And we do actually start to change little by little. It's going to be how we deal with. We want governments to change the things for the climate crisis, and we know we need that, but we also need to recycle ourselves. It's the same paradigm, I'm afraid. Thank you.
I have one last question.
Is there no escape?
I'm Amal Vyas, basically working on the Karen Blue Button implementation guide.
Okay.
And I would say that this is an implementation guide, first of its kind, I would say, that deals specifically with the financial world, the payer world. As you would expect, we have lots of questions and road to cover as far as terminologies. All these questions going around as far as should you create a court system, heavily interested in that, considering that there are terminologies out there established because X12 is a fairly established transaction standard and it has its own terminologies. There is very few FHIR-friendly terminologies available that we could use. So we have basically ended up creating our own court system that basically point to a landing page on a CMS, DRG court set.
So something we haven't talked about this morning because we haven't done it yet is, I think one of the responsibilities of the HTA is to, I like that word FHIR-friendly, to take something that is already out there, but is not, as a code system, but is not a FHIR-friendly code system. What can we do to bring those things together while still honoring the code system owner? Because this is their baby, and you're going to rely on them to parent it for the lifetime of your implementation guide and beyond, but that also makes it FHIR-friendly for what you need. So that is a work in progress. That is something we've only just become, in the last work group, aware of, and we're not terribly nimble but I'm trying to get more nimble to meet that need of this community.
Right, and I also understand that HL7 doesn't have to kind of do the heavy lifting. Part of the work of HTA would be to lobby with the court system owners to create FHIR-friendly terminologies.
Probably the role of the HTA will be to give the domain, which I think is you, the tools that you need to lobby, and some support in that lobbying. Because it's this balance between the terminology expertise and the domain expertise, and you're in a very specific domain. But yes, I think giving you the tools that you need to do that lobbying, even if it's down to things like sample letters where you fill in the bits, but that lays out the principles, hopefully in a way that can be useful.